DeRay McKesson is all about fighting for a better world. McKesson leapt onto the national stage 5 years ago when he joined protests against the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, becoming a prominent voice in the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2016, Time magazine named the author and podcast host one of the 30 most influential people on the internet. He's here to talk about how to reckon with injustice and how to imagine a world with less of it. Hello everyone, I'm Andy Serwer and welcome to Influencers. And welcome to today's guest, DeRay McKesson, author, activist, and host of the podcast, Pod Save the People. DeRay, great to see you.
It's so good to be here.
So I want to start off and ask you about the news, impeachment, and what you think about impeaching President Trump. Does that make sense, or should we wait till the election in November?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I think, if anything, it was odd to see the left sort of slow down the impeachment talk for so long. It was like, impeachment will be bad, it'll divide the country. I mean, that was the message from leading Democrats for a long time. And then we finally get to the Ukraine moment, and people are like, oh, that's really bad. You're like, well, he's done a lot of really bad things. So I think it's good that we're moving forward. It is still sort of weird to see Trump be so aggressive and so intense, and people still be reticent about fighting him.
But isn't it the case that the Senate's simply not going to vote to impeach him ultimately, so what's the point?
Yes, I think that, people like AOC have it perfect. It's like, we have a responsibility and we do our part. And we don't play the game before the game's played. So they're like, we have a responsibility to impeach. When it goes to the Senate, they have to do their part. And if they don't remove, then they don't remove. But that doesn't mean that we actually don't uphold our end of the bargain.
We're going to be starting the presidential election season right away. And so the Democrats, man, it's a big field. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. I mean, I'll drill down and ask you some specifics, but just generally speaking.
So like Warren, I think if anything, I don't understand the education plans of anybody. I think they're all off. So that's like one of my issues with Warren's plan. I think the criminal justice plan is a little narrow. I thought there'd be a bolder idea. But on the whole, I think she's really strong. I think what's interesting about Warren, though, is that she's sort of a victim of her own success. When you think about her being a progressive and da-da-da, is that it's interesting, white women actually aren't flocking around Warren, which is like an interesting demographic for her to be losing at this moment. And I think that there's a way that she talks about what the world can be that actually seems a little too aggressive for people, which is sort of odd because what she's saying is sort of basic, right? It's like, everybody should have health care. It's like not a radical idea. You shouldn't be mired in debt, not sort of a radical, like these things are actually sort of, we should normalize them. I do think AOC has probably done the best job on the left of saying big ideas in a way that seems really simple, right? Like sort of like, oh, this is like the Amazon thing in New York. She's like, Amazon can afford it. And people are like, you're wild. I can't believe you're going to ruin the economy. So many jobs. And she's like, watch and see. And then what does Amazon do? They come anyway, right? I think that Warren, people are receiving Warren as being aggressive, and she does have big ideas, but they're sort of normal ideas that we should be rallying around. Pete is interesting to me, not only because he continues to make a whole set of unforced errors, but because he is polling so low amongst Black people, but still has a national platform, and that to me, I'm just like confused by, right? So how can you raise so much money? How can you be a contender? And literally, you're like at 0 or 1 or 2% amongst Black people. And you cannot win. You will not win the nomination without Black support. I like Bernie. I think Bernie is sort of the same Bernie we saw in 2016. My only struggle with Bernie has always been, I think that the what is there, the how I've always been questioned. I never understood. So I think that Bernie can say like what we need to do. When you start to ask sometimes about how we do it, that's when it's just like, I think that it is a little shaky on that side. Who else? I like Castro. Castro's good.
You didn't mention Biden.
Oh, because there's a part of Biden that I understand the bravado, because it's like he has won everything every race he's been in. He's been elected since before I was born, And there is something about that it's like, why would you run for president? Like every single time people have counted you out and you've won. I think that Biden actually benefits from something similar to what Trump benefits from, in the sense that you're like, oh, okay, like he just stumbles sometimes. You're like, Biden will like get a fact wrong or like totally misrepresent something or say something really odd, and people are like, oh, that's just Biden, and you're like, okay, that's sort of weird. I think that we deserve somebody a little more to the left than Biden is. Biden, I think, still plays politics in a world that was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I don't think he's in a 2020 world right now. I think he can be. I think it's sort of a choice to live in the world that he lives in.
Who do you think is going to win, though?
I think that a Democrat will win. I don't know. I don't think Trump will be
But
president.
I mean, the nomination first, and then we'll talk about it.
I don't know. I think Warren might eke it out. I think Biden could win. I think between the two of them, I think either of them could win.
And would you support Biden?
Yes, I would vote. I'll vote for the nominee. Whoever the nominee is, I'll vote for the nominee.
And you think that they will beat President Trump in November?
Yeah, I think that they'll be, you think about 2016, there were a lot of people even on the left who participated in language and a logic that said president doesn't matter, right? Vote local, president really isn't where our fight should be, da-da-da-da. And then enter Trump, and people realized that that position was a wild position to be in. Like, I'll never forget when I publicly supported Hillary. I wrote this op-ed in the Washington Post. People called me everything but a child. I mean, it was really, from the left, people were like, I can't believe you would sell out like that. Like, I'm like, I believe this man, right? I believe him when he says he's gonna do all this damage in the country. But I think those people get it together. I think that people will mobilize out of necessity. And I think that what's interesting about Trump is that the trauma is not ending. Like, he's just sort of keeping it steady, right? Like, keeping his agenda steady. And I think that, like, the closer we get to election time, people realize that, like, whether they like the nominee or not, they just won't survive in a world where he's president.
So our country, DeRay, is so divided up right now. It's polarized. And, regardless of where you sit, perhaps even, you might agree with that point. If you're a Republican, you might agree with that. How can this country come back together again?
Yeah, I think that I don't know if I think about it as like a coming back together as much as it's a like, what do we do to move forward in a world where everybody can win? Nobody loses when everybody can eat. Nobody loses when everybody has access to a doctor. Nobody loses when every kid can read and write. Nobody loses when there's safety in communities and the police don't kill people. And I think there's like this weird logic that language like divided, it makes it seem like there's gonna be winners and losers. And it's like, I think that we can live in a world where like everybody eats breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? Like we should normalize this notion that like in the world that we wanna build, everybody wins. They do, I think in the world we live in today, there are clear winners and clear losers. There are some people who can afford breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and there's some people who can't. And it's like, we always think about poverty as a political choice. Poverty is not like a inherent necessity of the world. We think about hunger as a political choice. Hunger is not an inherent necessity of the world. These are things that people have allowed to happen. So when I think about how do we get to the other side of these things, it's what I appreciate about a Warren, what I appreciate about a Bernie, is that they have sort of normalized this idea of sort of dreaming big, about saying, Warren could have said, we're gonna like, give people more access to loans, right? And that has been a totally fine position for people for a long time. Instead, she was like, no debt. And you're like, okay, right? Like that is like a big idea, And I think that we're in the time, at least on the left, where we have collectively normalized that big ideas are things that we actually deserve. I think if there's anything that I worry about, I think that there's so many people for whom the system has never done good, has never helped them, has never really worked. And for them, a participation in sort of electoral politics has always seemed futile because it's never really worked for them. And as long as people like that feel like they are on the outside, then we will lose because they won't vote, right?
Right.
And this is my fight with Obama the last time we met with him. It's like, Obama is in that era of Democrats who sort of says, like, if you care about the country, vote. If you understand your power, vote. And the reality is like, I was one of the people who voted my entire life. I still got tear gas. I got dragged out of a police department by my ankles. The FBI visited my house. It wasn't that like voting stopped any of those things from happening. We think about voting as like one of the tools in a toolbox, right? So what we should be telling people in communities is like, if you want to change things, vote, participate at the local level, go to the school board meeting. Like, it is all of these things, right? You don't build a house with one tool, you build a house with a toolbox.
So the economy has done really well over the past decade. We're at the end of the decade.
For some people.
Yeah, well, but that's maybe a problem. I want to ask you about that because economists look at these broad measures: unemployment, GDP, the stock market, and yet you're unable with those metrics to drill down and actually look at real Americans. I mean, you can see wealth and income inequality, and those ideas and those numbers sort of run counter to these broader measures. So how is it? Is America in great shape economically or not?
I think it depends on who you ask, right? It's like, there are two ways that we can think about poverty. We can either think about poverty as a result of personal choices, or we can think about poverty as a result of structural choices, right? And the people who think about poverty as a result of personal choices, they participate in this logic that's like, economy's fine, right? It is getting better. It is like we're overall net positive. And it's like poverty rate's sort of pretty steady, right? It's like not, it hasn't had a huge dramatic decrease in poverty, certainly not childhood poverty, not in inner cities, not when we disaggregate the data around race when we think about poverty. But I'm always reminded that people didn't choose to be poor. It wasn't like whole communities woke up and they were like, you know what, poverty is my choice today. That's not happening, right? Structures like forced people into poverty. So I will be impressed about the economy when that changes, right? That's when I'll be like, let me know, right? And you think about what Trump just did in the past couple of weeks is that about 700,000 people are going to get kicked off food stamps, right? People who need food assistance from the federal government or people who need help from the federal government. It's like the economy's not getting better for any of those people. So when I think about the overall economy, I'm always wondering who is not captured in that data or how that data normalizes the idea that there just will be losers forever when we think about the economy. I want to think about an economic situation that says that there will always be some people who just have more money, that will be sort of a condition of what an economy probably looks like. But there should be a floor that means that everybody has access to a set of basic necessities and we guarantee it. And the reality is we have the resources and the money. So when people tell me, oh, I don't know how to fund, it's like, Trump gave $700 billion to the military. We weren't looking for money there, we found it. We could end poverty, we could take everybody out of poverty with $200 billion. So it's never a matter of resources. It's always a matter of, do we think that people are worth it?
Are billionaires okay in your book? Is it okay to be that rich in America?
I don't know how you become a billionaire without relying on a system that exploits people. So the question is not like, the question to me is not, are billionaires okay? The question is like, how do you even, what structures and systems exist to even allow a billionaire to like come to be? You know what I mean? So I'm interested in that question, and I don't know an answer that is not rooted in some sort of exploitation in some way. So you have a whole set of employees who make minimum wage and you make $200 million a year. Like, think about WeWork. It's like, how do you get a golden parachute in the billions and then you lay off 1,700 people? That sort of seems like an imbalance to me. You know what I mean? So I'm interested in that. And it's like, you think about the only way you become a billionaire in this moment is like to do something where you aren't paying taxes in any way that you think about Buffett's statement, right? That he's like, I paid less taxes. And you're like, that is wild. You know what I mean?
Right. Let me ask you a question, DeRay. Do you think Donald Trump has done anything good?
When I think about good is a moral position to me, and no. So if we think about good as like something morally upright and upstanding, then I cannot think of something that he has done that has been morally right. Has Trump done something that has probably benefited some people? Sure. The First Step Act has benefited some people, right?
The what? I'm sorry?
The First Step Act. So this was this criminal justice thing.
Yes.
Do I think he did it because his values align with it? No. Do I think that it was like a value proposition for him? No, I think it was like a re-election tool. And the thing about the First Step Act that we always remind people is that about 30% of the people who were released under the provisions of the First Step Act were actually immediately deported. So that's not even like that's not even a net positive, right? Because we shouldn't trade drug dealers for immigrants. Like, we don't trade out people who are in the incarceration system. So I guess that would be like a thing that people have benefited from. I think that if you are rich and white, then I think that he probably has done morally right things for you. I think that there are a host of people who either became millionaires or walked into long fortunes because of government contracts under this administration, or that they just benefited from a host of things. So you think about, one of the things that I was talking with somebody about last week is, you probably don't even know this, is that he is deregulating the pork industry. So inspectors, the USDA has actually removed inspectors from the pork slaughterhouses. They don't exist anymore. And the slaughterhouses can now inspect themselves. And the USDA has also removed the requirements around the line speed. So the government actually regulates how many much pork can be slaughtered in a given moment. And those regulations are completely gone, right? So the only benefit that that would have is that people can increase the production of pork dramatically, right? But at the cost to workers' like limbs and lives. So you think about that industry will probably benefit dramatically financially from what Trump has done, even while the workers are going to be decimated in the process.
Right. Well, no doubt, wealth and income inequality has to be addressed somehow, and maybe we aren't still doing that in this country, I think.
Yeah, and this is why I do benefit the national conversation that Warren, Kamala, a host of people have participated in, is that we have finally started to talk about wealth inequality is not the result of personal choices, but the result of a system that made choices for people. And that is a good thing, right? The question is like, how do we normalize some big ideas around that? So what would it look like to, I live in Baltimore. It's like, what would it look like to fund the school system equitably? Right. As long as we are, I was the chief of human capital in the school system, and we would be at cabinet meetings, and it's like, as long as we are choosing between like fixing the boiler and putting a elevator in a school or fixing the elevator, like we're always making these impossible choices,
right. Yeah, well, let's talk about Baltimore for a second, because why is the city so messed up? I mean, it became a target for Trump, and then there was the fight with Elijah Cummings, the late Elijah Cummings. But, people have said to me, well, Pittsburgh's not so bad, and other cities aren't so bad. What is it with Baltimore?
I think it's a couple of factors with the city. I think that some is leadership. I think that, we have a strong mayor system in Baltimore, which works when you have a great mayor. We haven't had a great mayor in a long time. So when you don't have a great mayor, what you find is like the nonprofit community is always trying to just sort of pick and patch to like keep everything afloat. And I think what we know now that people sort of didn't accept 20, 30 years ago is that programs are good. Mm-hmm. But programs will never, ever deal with a scaled solution because that's not, they can't. So you think about like, why do we need 1 million programs to feed the homeless under bridges? Is because we've allowed homelessness to flourish. Only a structure can actually do something about homelessness as like a large problem. Programs will deal with like individual people, plug individual gaps, but they just can't scale. So Baltimore has struggled with like, what does it mean you have a strong mayor system and like haven't had a strong mayor in a long time? I think the second, and I think that some TV shows have popularized like what corruption looks like at the city level, that like what happens when everybody is sort of related or there's some sort of financial so we haven't had independent people who like don't benefit from the system, who like don't, like I think that has been a real thing. Mm-hmm. And the third is really money. So what happens when the structure just isn't funded in a way that makes sense? So you think about the school system, $1 billion organization in the city. School system employs as many people as the city itself, which is sort of wild. The school system has never, ever been equitably funded. So every year the system is like choosing between like, fixing a boiler or buying textbooks or hiring one teacher. You're making a set of impossible choices. And on the top of that, the city's population is at the lowest it's been.
Yeah. 600,000.
It'll be 600. It'll be lower than 600,000 in the next census.
Right.
Which is wild. The school system is staffed. There are enough buildings for 100,000 kids, and we're a little bit under 80 now. So that is wild.
Depopulation. Hey, let me turn to Black Lives Matter, and I want to ask you, where does that movement stand today? What is your role there? And maybe even give us sort of a 101 of what the organization is, because people, I think there's some misconceptions about, is it a organization or a movement, or exactly what is it?
Yeah, so I think about it as a movement. So what does it mean when people come together who share a single idea? And you think about in 2014, after the death of Mike Brown, people all across the country mobilized. It would have been
in Ferguson.
In Ferguson, yep, would have been impossible without Ferguson, which was what I was to say. And I think about Ferguson as a phenomenon, right? It was this moment where everything aligned. It was like the right people. It was Twitter. It was sort of a media landscape that was interested in a story. It was all this stuff happened. And the protest spread across the country, as you know, and people started to call it Black Lives Matter. What called people to the street originally was the idea of police violence and this idea that we can live in a world without police, or without the police killing people at the very least. And I think that idea is still present. I'm mindful that the civil rights movement was a decade-long worth of activism. And we're in year 5 since the protests began. If anything, when I worry about the narrative that people have, is people participate in this narrative that said that like 3 people started a movement or 1 person started a movement. And what was so beautiful about St. Louis is that so many people came outside, and like that is the birth of a movement. This is not the civil rights movement. It was not started by schools. It wasn't born out of churches. It was people, and it's such a reductive narrative to say that a trio or 1 person sort of started a whole movement, that actually erases the work of so many incredible people. But when we think about the issue of police violence, it's what is sort of sobering is that the police have actually killed more people since the protest, not less, which is wild. And
Since Ferguson.
since 2014, yeah. A third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is actually killed by a police officer, which is also sort of wild. And this is the first year ever where Black people are more afraid of being killed by a police officer than being killed by community violence. So the question becomes, what do we do? And I think that what we know now that we didn't know in 2014 is that the structure has to change. I think that we thought that like if we brought attention to it, things would sort of move, and we realized that the attention actually hasn't moved the structure. So I'll give you an example here in New York City, and I'm sure you know de Blasio. You obviously know Garner, who got killed by the police here.
Eric Garner.
And you know that Pantaleo got fired, the officer got fired not too long ago. Is that chokeholds got banned in 1993 in New York City by Ray Kelly, who was not a progressive police chief by any stretch of the imagination, but banned then. De Blasio lifted the ban on chokeholds in 2016. Shooting and moving vehicles got banned in 1972 in New York City. De Blasio lifted the ban on shooting and moving vehicles in 2016. And in 2016, de Blasio also removed the requirement that deadly force be used as a last resort. So New York City is actually less safe for civilians than it was before Garner gets killed. The CCRB would have never been able to actually fire Pantaleo if the rules that de Blasio put in place in 2016 had been in effect when Garner gets killed. So you actually see people like de Blasio publicly saying, oh, I'm standing with the family, we need justice, at the same time that he's actually rolling back the requirements that actually restrict the use of force by the NYPD.
Right. Let me ask you about a demonstration that you were involved in Baton Rouge, and there's a court case now. The ACLU wants the Supreme Court to take this up, which is to say you were being sued by a Baton Rouge police officer for being part of a riot where a rock was thrown and hit him and injured him. They're not saying that you threw the rock, but just that you were there and encouraged the riot, so that makes you culpable for his injury. First of all, do I have that right? And second of all, where do things stand with that?
Yeah, so that was the claim. So I got sued by 5 police officers in 2 cities. We got them all dismissed, which was good. One of the cases, this John Doe, the officer said he was so afraid for his safety that he is John Doe, so it's DeRay McKesson. He appealed to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit overruled the dismissal and said that I can be held civilly negligent for this officer being hit by a rock. We have appealed. We just petitioned the Supreme Court on Friday last week. And the reason that we did this is that, you know, if this ruling stands and the Supreme Court doesn't reverse the decision of the Fifth Circuit, then it means that any organizer for any cause in any city can be held liable for any injury that happens. So say, for example, you know, you're doing a rally about something, some random person comes in and throw a bottle, and you were the organizer. The person that gets hit by that bottle could sue you. That is wild. You know, that would just stifle any sort of organizing, any sort of protest if this ruling becomes precedent across the country, or even if it becomes precedent in the Fifth Circuit where 33 million people live. So that's why we're petitioning. And if the court hears it, it'll be the first case since the civil rights movement's defining case around the right to protest.
And where do you think it's going to end up? I mean, how hopeful are you, I guess, for the Supreme Court to rule in your favor?
Well, I'm hopeful because there's not been a case like this that has actually come before the court in a very long time, almost since the 60s when the original case came before the court. I think that we all were surprised at the intensity with which the Fifth Circuit sort of held its decision, especially because it is a decision that we think goes contrary to established case law around this issue.
Let me ask you about technology, DeRay. A lot has changed. You use Twitter. iPhones are used in protests to document what the police is doing, or just when the police are taking action against someone. It's a very powerful tool, and you're also the host of a podcast. So how has this changed the work of an activist, I guess?
Yeah, I think that what's cool about it is that no longer do we have to wait for mainstream media to tell us that the idea works, or to be the arbiter, or to validate something. We actually can go straight to people ourselves, which is a which is a huge win. I think about the protests is that if I had to wait for a newspaper reporter to believe in the story I was telling, we would have been screwed in the street, especially because at the beginning, people didn't believe us. People thought we were dramatic. They didn't think the police were dramatic. But we could tell our story in real time, and that was unbelievably powerful. The second thing is that I'm mindful that this work is two-pronged, that some of it is storytelling, some of it is structural. We talked about the structural, but the second is actually like pushing people to imagine the world a little differently. So, you think about, you probably jaywalked before, right? You probably been over the speed limit.
Confessions.
Is that like, I say that because the reality is like you're a criminal, right? You have totally committed a crime.
Yep.
But when we work with people, you say to them like, what do we do about criminal justice? They often think about like those people. They're like, what do we do with those people, the criminals? And it's like, what we do with people who've committed crimes is not about what we do with those people. It's actually about what we do with each other, because you wake up every day and look at somebody who has broken a crime. The reality is that like we don't all have criminal records. That is a difference. That the enforcement apparatus of the government is what's different. So you think about New York City, 90% of the people arrested in New York City for smoking weed are black and brown. And you and I both know it's just not black and brown people in the city smoking weed, right?
Right.
So much of our work is the storytelling, is like shaping narratives, is helping people think about the world differently. And that would not be possible if we weren't in control of the mechanisms.
Let me ask you a little bit about leadership, DeRay. You were class presidents growing up in many of your classes, that's my understanding. I know you were class president at Bowdoin College.
And school president.
Right, and school president. So what is it that you sort of look to do personally to put yourself into a leadership role like that?
I think one is know the content well. I know a lot about the police. I knew a lot about the stuff when I was in school. So, when I think about what it means to walk into the room and lead, is like some of it is the only way that you can put the pieces together is knowing enough of what the content is so that you can actually be thoughtful and you can make decisions that make a lot of sense. The second is to remember that you're only as strong as the people around you. So how do you share power has to be a big part of it. So I think about in the protests, and this is the work that people never see. It's like so much of my work is like connecting people. Like today I'm on the board of Rock the Vote, and I got a call from somebody that was like, this big organization wants to do something around voting. Can you connect us? So like so much of it is like, how do I share the access that I have? How do I like make sure you talk to this person, or I think you two can do something really cool together? How can I put you two in the room? That is actually a key part of it. I think that what the worst leaders do is that they hoard power, that they sort of make everything flow through them. I think the third is this idea that how do we model believing in people in ways that allow them to do whatever their magic is? So I think about what was so cool about the protests for me as somebody who had been in all these roles before, is that some of the most important people are like 19, 18, people who I would have never been peers with in a professional setting because I was doing something in the school system, so they would have been too young to be a senior leader in the school system. But all of a sudden we're like in the street together, and it's like, that was a great idea. And your great idea was not sort of filtered through your age. It wasn't filtered through your gender or your sexuality. It was like, this is a great idea, Right. And I think that the more leaders create space for anybody, regardless of role, regardless of any identity marker, to like put a great idea in this space, like I think that we all win.
You have a picture of yourself, a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, right? How cool is that?
It was really surreal. I turned the corner. I just saw it for the first time. So I turn the corner and I'm trying to take a picture, and this tour comes, and the docent is like, he's like, "That's you," and I'm like, "It is me," So yeah. It was really sweet, very kind. A photographer took the photo of me after I gave a talk I just gave a talk somewhere, and I get this email being like, "Can we do a photo?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." I'm like, "Okay," and then he submitted the photo to this competition at the National Portrait Gallery, and they selected it. So big honor.
Blue Patagonia vest in the portrait. You always wear that. Why is that? And does Patagonia sponsor you?
Patagonia does not sponsor me, though that's a rumor. This is one of the only things I have from the protests from when we were in the streets, and it reminds me that
same one.
Same one. Yeah, they just fixed it, so it looks much better today. But it's the same one, and I kept wearing it after we left those initial street moments because it reminded me that everything we went through was real. I think about my phone was hacked. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned for raising money to try and kill me. I think about all the things that have happened in the past 5 years, and I never want to forget that they're real. I am so blessed to be able to do things like this and talk to you and be in so many rooms, and I never want to forget what it was like when it was illegal to stand still in the middle of the street, what it was like when we slept in cars, and I don't want to forget that. And this is like my way of carrying it with me.
What about the future for you, DeRay, finally? And you ran for mayor of Baltimore. That didn't work out. Where do you see yourself 20 years from now?
I think we'll win. I think that we'll look back and be like, wow, it's really hard to sort of push this idea of policing in a world without the police. And I think that we'll get there. Hopefully it doesn't take 20 years. I think that we're actually on the precipice. I think what's interesting about the police is that there's so many myths out there. So like, what do you think it means when the police solve a crime? Like, what do you think happens? Like, what are the ingredients of solve?
Well, they do work, arrest someone, take them to court, trial, person's found guilty, it's all tied up with a bow.
Yep. So what it actually means all across the country is that it just means that at least one arrest was made. That is all solve means, which is like not what anybody would think solve means, right? So when you look around the country and you're like, oh, the police solved 20% of the crimes, you're like, that just means they made an arrest. That doesn't mean they arrested the right person, doesn't mean they tracked conviction. You know, so what people think is happening in police departments is actually sort of interestingly not happening. And the reality is that the best the police can do is get there after the bad things already happen. We actually want to live in a world where the bad things don't happen in the first place. So most of the work about safety is actually not about policing, it's about poverty and addiction. So when we think about the end of crime is actually the end of poverty and the end of addiction. It's not the presence of police.
Seems like you might have quite a bit of work in front of you then.
A lot of work for us to do.
Right. All right, DeRay McKesson, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
You've been watching Influencers. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll see you next time.